Thank you very much for coming today. It's a very great pleasure to introduce our public lecture by the internationally renowned scholar Henry Jenkins. This is part of the Interdisciplinary Italy Summer School, which is hosted by the Italian department at Trinity College Dublin, and we also have the support of University College London and Royal Holloway. Now, Henry Jenkins is the Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinema, Arts and Education at the University of Southern California, and he's the founder and former co-director of the MIT Comparative Media Studies program. He's a very prolific writer. He's written or edited 20 books on various aspects of media and popular culture, including Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, Convergence Culture, where old and new media collide, Spreadable Media, Creating Meaning and Value in a Networked Culture, and By Any Media Necessary, New Youth Activism. He has two more books that just came out this spring, Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change in Comics and Stuff. He's co-host of How Do You Like It So Far, a podcast which explores popular culture in a changing world. And he has run Confessions of an ACA blog for more than 15 years. Now, if you're asking why our discipline of Italian studies might have a particular interest in Henry Jenkins' work, since this has to do with our Interdisciplinary Italy Summer School this year, the answer actually goes back to 2007 and the internationally acclaimed left-wing Italian writers known collectively as Booming, who are authors of books like Manituana and of Q. And we were talking just before this about the relationship between Q actually and QAnon, where it may have been appropriated in the States by QAnon. So they're an important collective of writers, of politically orientated Italian writers, and they have a long-standing interest in what they refer to as communication warfare. And they were looking for novel ways to break communicative conventions. So Wu Ming in 2006 actually wrote an email to Henry outlining what they saw as the communalities between what their collective had been doing and the work described by Henry in Convergence Culture. And Wu Ming Wan, who I know they've been in contact with Wu Ming over the two of them been in contact for quite some time now. But Wu Ming Wan explained to Jenkins how his theory reflected the things that they in Italy had been doing and theorizing for more than 12 years. I'll bet that they kind of added this on with a more kind of radical or activist edge. Kind of guerrilla warfare, old and new media collision, copyleft orientated practices, media hoaxes, and so on. And after this initial contact, two things in Italy happened. First, Wu Ming wrote the preface to the 2007 Italian translation of Jenkins' books, Convergence Culture. And given the cult status of these writers in Italy at this time, critical attention in Italy would be firmly drawn towards Jenkins' ideas. And the second thing that happened was that they took Jenkins' ideas and translated them in what might be considered a kind of online laboratory for convergence, the website for their collectively written historical novel, Manituana, which is still existent. You can go and have a look at it, actually. And this narrates the story of the American Revolution from the point of view of the Indians, in other words, the losing side. So in Italian studies, Henry Jenkins' work has actually had a surprisingly interesting resonance, I think, a peculiar collaboration that took place between an international group of rather subversive writers and Henry's work as a media theorist. Now today, Henry's not talking about things specific to do with Italian at all, but he's looking at themes of convergence and participatory culture and looking at those when those meet COVID and meet COVID times, really. So without further ado, I will pass over to Henry to begin his talk. We're very grateful to him to coming to the summer school and to coming to Trinity Online and to give this talk here this evening.
So, well, thanks for the great introduction. And yes, my relationship to Wu Ming has been really meaningful to me through the years also, and I'm excited that it's brought some conversations in Italy. I wish I had the Italian skills to follow them a little more closely, but I'm happy to be speaking to this group. I should be very clear from the beginning, I'm offering what is overwhelmingly an American perspective on what has been a global pandemic. And I do so not out of arrogance, but out of modesty, that Americans too easily go around the world and comment on situations they know very little about from the ground. My work emerges from real intimacy with popular media. And so I don't like to talk about other people's culture and other people's politics to any great degree. I may sometimes throw out a pointer or two to things that I know are going on, but really I'm expecting you to fill in the gaps and think about your experiences of the pandemic as I talk through this snapshot of American media as it's been reshaped over the last year. I'm calling this a fever dream, both because of the metaphoric value of that phrase, but also because I think we don't know everything that's happening yet. There's so much we're still processing. So this is in some way a feverish presentation of lots of things coming together rather than a sustained analysis of any one thing. So think of it as like a delusional fever dream where lots of things are swirling around. Okay, let's see. How orders my thing? Oops, there we go. Okay. So when I was asked to write early in the pandemic about how COVID might impact what was happening, or at least that's how I defined my task, I was drawn back to Zygmunt Vertov. And Vertov, in one of his key essays around Man with a Movie Camera, has this passage, I am Kino I am a builder. I have placed you, who I've created today, in an extraordinary room, which did not exist until just now, when I also created it. In this room, there are 12 walls shot by me in various parts of the world. In bringing together shots of walls and details, I managed to arrange them in an order that is pleasing and to construct with intervals correctly a film phase, which is the room. And I don't know about you, but I've spent the better part of the last year and a half in something like Vertov's room, right? That the bringing together of different spaces, different walls to construct a composite room that we follow with our mind and construct as a space of conversation in dialogue. In fact, we're in Vertov's room right now is really important. And so when I think about media through COVID, I start with Zoom, right? And which is a technology that none of us probably had used before COVID, that now more and more of us that have experiences with, having a transformative effect on how we communicate around the world, and also how we see each other. That is the world without makeup, the world with stringy hair that may not have been washed in the last 24 hours, the world where we're seeing each other as intimate spaces, the world where we are closer to the camera than we would sit facing each other. And so there's a kind of weird intimacy that's created through body space, I think, on Zoom that has consequences of how we interact with each other. To me, as someone who grew up born in 1958, I think of the Zoom as the picture phone is finally achieved. And this is just some of the models I was given across the first parts of my lifetime, where people were promising us a technology that combines the telephone with the television, TV set, as the Western Electric ad says there. Someday you will be a star. Well, there's so many questions in my mind growing up about how the picture phone would operate, how we would deal with unexpected calls and so forth. And Zoom has worked through that, at least how we're using Zoom works through that in a way that by appointment, we are coming together for these kinds of conversations. Now, when I wrote that original piece, my impressions were shaped by two early things that had happened on the web during the pandemic. One was this video that was created by a stunt director in Hollywood who mostly worked with women, who constructed this fight scene that involved all of these actresses, very famous actresses, each recording a shot, splicing it together. It was all spliced together and sent out over the internet. And it was a way of engaging with each other across physical distances using these emerging technologies. And to me, that's part of what reminded me of Vertov and the construction of cinematic reality through montage that Vertov was talking about. The other was this game Sequester that I ended up participating in on a web platform. I don't even remember which one, I think, but it had contestants from Survivor and Big Brother coming together in this kind of composite space and voting each other out over a period of time, moving from room to room, voting each other out, playing reality competitive games. It's worth noting it wasn't just American contestants, but British, Australian, South African, New Zealand contestants. And because of the global circulation of underground copies of Survivor amongst fans, those non-celebrities were known by people in the Survivor community worldwide. And there was a layer of fan commentary on top of that. So the sense that we were finding new pastimes, new ways of fan behavior in response to this technology, in response to the pandemic, really excited me to think more about what was going to happen next and to observe it more closely. It didn't take long for the intimate reality of Zoom to lead to a more fantastic landscape, with more and more people putting fake backgrounds behind them, and a lot of them expressing their connections to popular media, and for commercial entities to start selling those Zoom backgrounds. So Disney owns 3/4 of the landscape of our collective imaginations these days. So they, of course, were one of the first to sell us their imagery as something we could use to express our fandom to each other during the pandemic. But then over time, sheer exhaustion sets in. And I think Zoom fatigue is part of the evolutionary cycle of Zoom as a media technology, which has reached maximum penetration. And now there is a kind of pulling away, although I hope we don't lose all of the advantages like international communication that Zoom has opened up and enabled over the last year. Now, part of what interests me about this early moment of the pandemic was the shutting down of cinema, right? The closing off of film exhibition spaces. To a large degree, the release and distribution of films slowed to a crawl. We saw the shutting down of Broadway, and we saw the shutting down of theme parks, all representing the closing off of some major spaces of mass media experiences that we expect to be there. So what would happen with the silencing of important forms of mass media? I didn't include television in this set of images because we expected television to run out of content. And to some degree in the US, the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, did effectively run out of new content during the pandemic because of the slowing of production. But streaming has, if anything, intensified its hold on our culture. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So with the shutting down of Disneyland, I was fascinated to see the rise of amateur videos where people were reenacting the rides that they missed. So theme park fans were performing Pirates of the Caribbean, using cell phone cameras to capture, using things they had around the house. And that was an early news story coming out of this. And I saw that Rebecca Williams is there, and she's one of the people who writes about theme park fandom. So I'm thrilled to see her in the audience for this. We saw celebrities step in and use amateur technologies to do public performances. And here's a rather famous performance of Stephen Sondheim's Ladies Who Lunch that was widely circulated in those early things. So it's hard to think of Meryl Streep as a fan media producer, yet effectively the line between participatory culture expression and mass media expression starting to close, at least the technical standards. Of course, they got wider distribution right away, they have more visibility, but technically the barrier between the two is almost completely closed during this period of time. And I think that has interesting consequences. So someone like Mel Brooks and his son produce a video telling people to wear masks, keep social distance, and they distribute it to the same channels that amateurs might distribute things through, and with the same slightly blurry, grainy look that we expect to see in amateur media. Survivor, when it reached its season finale during that period of time, to pick back up on what I talked about earlier, Jeff Probst has to build a set in his garage, has to assemble it himself in order to perform his function as the host of the reunion show at the end of that season of Survivor. And that's example of the kinds of adjustments and the blurring of intimate spaces and public spaces that even mass media like television goes through during this period of time. But it also has been a year where amateur produced video gets amplified by mass media. And here I have just a selection of the many Karens out there in the United States who've been captured on film and whose videos sparked more and more intense conversations about racism and systemic and structural racism over the last year, leading up to the massive protest around Black Lives Matter. I think grassroots media plays such an important roles there. I also, in the last year, went to funerals on Zoom. Painful processes of letting go of friends, of students, including several students who committed suicide, which were very, very difficult to experience. But the sense that every ritual of our lives was translated into screen time, into the sharing of media with each other through participatory channels, I think is what's striking about that. So it's the boundaries between things break down as we go deeper and deeper into the Zoom era. I'm going to step back and say a couple of things about the frame I use to analyze this. And much of this I wrote about in Convergence Culture, which came out in 2006. But I think we've seen a lot of change since then, but that framework still works. And the idea there was that we were moving toward a space where every story, every image, every sound, every relationship, every institution would be coming at us through every available media channel. That we would move media from space to space illegally if it wasn't available to us legally. And that as a consequence, decisions being made in teenagers' bedrooms were as important for understanding the media landscape in some ways as decisions made in corporate boardrooms, so that there was this blurring of boundaries. And my argument here is that that blurring has continued to intensify, especially in the last year, where organizations that once warned kids and parents about letting their kids have too much screen time have had to remain silent because everything is screen time. But the point I and other people were making was it's not about screens, it's about what uses we're making of screens and what relationships are expressed through screens. And so recognizing that schools' communication capacity may be different than 4chan or 8chan is a really important part of this process of sorting through that we collectively have had to engage in the last year. That Convergence Culture talks about transmedia storytelling using the example of the Matrix, but that system has become more and more elaborate as we look at something like Marvel. And Marvel initially seems to achieve the radical intertextuality of transmedia, the bringing together of many stories across many different texts without in fact using other ancillary other related media that effectively. The television was largely bracketed off from film, or comics and games are bracketed out from film to a large degree. But with Disney's buying up of Fox and ownership over all of the Marvel IP, And with its launch of Disney Plus, it's brought the Marvel universe more fully into its control in the last year. And so we're now seeing much stronger interconnections between the films and the television properties. And it's everyone's guess how WandaVision or Loki's plot developments are going to feed into the Doctor Strange movie that's coming out, which there's a lot of anticipation around because of that will be the first film fully affected by this new televisual strategy. And that's part of the story of the pandemic times as well. So it's not mass media has totally gone away, but cinema has been largely silent over this time or folded into other media. My notion of convergence culture, when I was critiqued by a cultural studies journal, they said, what kind of coherent notion of culture could describe what's going on here? I go back to Raymond Williams. I don't know about you guys, but Raymond Williams says culture is ordinary. That's the first fact. Every human society is its own shape, its own purpose, its own meanings. Every human society expresses these in institutions and in arts and learning. The making of the society is the finding of common meanings and directions, and its growth is an active debate and amendment under the pressure of experience, contact, and discovery, writing itself into the land. And there's more packed into those handful of words by a man who was writing in his early 20s in 1958, the year I was born, than I can possibly unpack, right? I read that essay, Culture is Ordinary, again every year because it's an article of faith for me. But convergence culture is both top-down, expression by institutions and arts, and it's the everyday lives that we live. So those funerals that I attended are part of how convergence culture operates at the current moment. It is the bringing together of practices of everyday life with artistic and commercial and educational functions all together in that soup of contemporary media that represents what I was describing as convergence culture. And that involves those distinctions cultural studies often makes between folk culture, mass culture, and now what I add to that is participatory culture. So I love this picture of this women making quilts because my grandmother makes quilts and I like to make quilts in Appalachia, and she grew up in a setting not unlike this. And so I think of her as a remix artist who learned from the community the basic practices in an informal way, the community is pooling its resources here to make something that's a collective expression. They're making it out of fragments of already existing material from the textile mills where many of their husbands worked during this period of time. And they're bringing it together to create a unique artistic form that exists at the intersections between those borrowed fragments of material. And to me, that's the contemporary art of remix or fan culture as much as anything else. So we see grassroots responses to COVID. We see people all over the world gathering on balconies and ringing bells for medical workers at a certain hour. And it's a ritual that I participated in from my balcony in Los Angeles. That process is, I would say, a folk culture process, and that still operates in response to the mass media that we live in. But mass media is media that's mass produced, mass distributed, largely for economic purposes. And that's also part of the picture today. And if we think about those early moments of COVID, certain text resonated for communities, and the release of the Studio Ghibli films for American streaming services here is shown on Netflix. That was not where it was released in the US. It was released on HBO Max, but that release, those films took on a special meaning in the early days of COVID, as did Animal Crossing, right? And the sheer number of friends who I talked to who were baking sourdough bread and playing Animal Crossing to get through those early days is really striking. So here's a mass-produced cultural commodity becomes such a central part of the everyday lives of consumers. Participatory culture then is a culture where we radically expand the number of people who get to participate in the production and distribution of culture. And here I'm using cosplay and Yoyogi Park to represent that process, but we could use almost anything in the fan community to illustrate how people, everyday people, are taking mass culture stories as the raw material for their own cultural expression. In the same way, arguably, that my grandmother and her community in Appalachia took scraps of cloth and turned them into raw materials for their cultural production. So in my writing, I define participatory culture as having relatively low barriers for engagement, strong support for sharing creations with others, informal mentorship. Members believe their contribution matter. They care about others' opinions of themselves and their work. Not every member must contribute, but all must believe they're free to contribute when ready, and what they contribute will be appropriately valued. So I should make clear, this is an aspirational definition. It is the values of many of the communities I've looked at. Those values are not always achieved. And indeed, there's lots of important critiques, say, of fandom and racial marginalization, exclusion there. And there is a strong sense that not every member's contributions are equally valued in fan fiction sites, for example, today. But it's an important set of values to hold on to as we try to articulate what kind of world a fully realized participatory culture would look like. That said, I always stress these days that it is a more participatory culture than what we had before. It is not a fully participatory culture. And the inequalities of participation were made visible by, for example, moving education online. And this is a picture of the daughter of one of my colleagues at doing school at home. And this is a photograph. Next to that is a photograph that the news media captured of two kids in a Taco Bell parking lot trying to use the Wi-Fi there in order to do their schoolwork and attend classes. Because something like a quarter of students in Los Angeles have not been able to go to public school for the last year and a half during the shutdown. And that really caused attention to the technical barriers to participation. Masked by that are the social cultural barriers to participation that I think are still centrally part of any conversation we might have. With spreadable media, we extended the notion of participation beyond production of media to include circulation. When we spread media from one place to another, as happened incredibly often during the pandemic, we're also participating in shaping the culture around us. And that book is all about that. That circulation then can expand, unauthorized circulation can then expand in cultural production in generative ways. And here I'm looking at folk cultural production using Star Wars as an example. This is these are shadow puppet performance in Malaysia using the Star Wars characters. So if you look closely, that's Princess Leia, Darth Vader, and some stormtroopers from New Hope. That allows localization on the ground. So these are boxed figures from Moscow, embedded dolls. This is from a website for Muslim fans around the world, showing how they can perform identities from Star Wars while maintaining modesty and wearing hijabs. And so how do you adopt your hijab into Princess Leia's hair bobs, for example? This is from the beaches of Rio, where sand sculpture is used to construct the constructor representation of Star Wars. This is from the Navajo artist who was reconstructing Yoda as a shaman figure. We saw that just on the eve of the pandemic, we saw a spectacular example of that with the figure of Baby Yoda from the Mandalorian, which instantly became a figure that fans engaged with and reconstructed. So within seconds, seemingly, memes are being produced to represent Baby Yoda and use it in various ways. But as Christmas approached in 2019, the absence of merchandise around Baby Yoda led to a springing of grassroots creations of Baby Yodas on eBay. So when Disney finally released its own Baby Yoda materials, it sent cease and desist letters. So now if you want grassroots Baby Yodas, you look for Green Alien Baby, which is simply a way of getting around the copyright regulations that Disney enforces on its users. Participatory culture also represents itself through things like fan cultural production, more generally, fan fiction, fan vidding, cosplay, all constitutes part of this participatory culture. Because a participatory culture is unregulated, both positive and negative developments around the fan participation take place. And we see this trope of the toxic fan spread through the media in the last couple of years. It is part of a larger picture. It is absolutely the case that there are toxic male fans who had a huge backlash against diversity in media. It is also the case that fan creators also have been modeling what a more diverse fan culture, a more inclusive media culture could look like, and through race bending practices, for example, or race casting practices, and writing fan fiction that represent diverse reworkings of these characters. That gets much less media coverage. I'm not saying it is the whole picture either, but I think it's part of the picture we want to pay attention to. But fandom is only one of a range of communities that have played important roles in keeping their population sane and socially connected during the pandemic. My son came to live with me during the pandemic. He was suffering depression and anxiety, chronic anxiety. For him, the social network that mattered was the ASMR community. And he and I have been writing a piece together about the way ASMR leaders, particularly women, took on almost a therapeutic role and an active community building role through their Twitch streams and their YouTube videos during this period of time, acknowledging the pain and anxiety that people are suffering, offering media that was less toxic and more soothing for people to consume. Mourning loss, celebrating successes in a networked way during this period of time. And there are complexities about emotional labor and fan labor one wants to talk about here, but I also observed firsthand through my son how much those communities mattered to people and how much participatory culture aspects of them mattered to people during this period of global crisis. I also was paying attention to this group Illuminative, which is a group that's called attention to Native American stories in America, and particularly contemporary Native American stories, and has this podcast that I really have enjoyed listening to off and on during this period of time. Their research shows that as much as a quarter of Americans do not believe Native Americans still live in our midst. The Native Americans for them live in the past. So part of the work of Illuminative is to publicize the existence of Native Americans. And there have been some success stories in the last year or two of mass media production with largely Native writers' rooms that have grown out of their efforts to lobby Hollywood. But they also were playing a role in connecting Native communities together during this time where Native communities were particularly adversely affected by COVID, had real crisis in healthcare, and yet rallied together and helped each other survive in really significant and interesting ways. I got this in the mail yesterday, so I plopped it in here. And the number I'm interested in this is 490 million new social media users between January 2020 and January 2021. So that tells us how vital social media was and how those people who had been holdouts up to that point came flooding in to participate in some of the conversations taking place here, not just around COVID, but around all the political turmoil that we've seen. As the thing progresses, people have became more and more sophisticated. Mass media producers became more and more sophisticated in how they could combine social media tools in a moment of social isolation and maintain normalcy in production. And the Peabody Award body, I was a member of their jury up until this year. This year's jury gave an award to the Colbert Show for the ways it was able to integrate Colbert recording at home with guests recording from their home, with the band playing each from separate locations to sort of create a mass media phenomenon that had huge viewership. I think as we think about the political crises of the last year, we start to see how participatory culture yields participatory politics. And this is a definition created by the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network that's no longer ended in last in 2016, but it was an interdisciplinary group of scholars that I was part of. And so they talked about acts of investigation, mobilization, circulation and production, dialogue and feedback, all as tools that younger activists have been using to express themselves politically or in this networked era. And we saw that in powerful ways during the Black Lives Matter protest in the United States. I, in downtown LA, felt like I was at ground zero for much of the protest in Los Angeles, because on one side of my building, protesters were marching down the street. On the other side of our building, the National Guard and with tanks were rallying and getting ready to stage interventions. And over my building at any moment in time, there might be as many as 3 police and news helicopters flying overhead. But I could not understand from my apartment what was taking place, because the news media in LA did a crap job of covering these protests. But if I looked on my cell phone, I would, through Twitter, through other social networking, I was seeing live feeds, I was seeing videos being posted, I was seeing citizen journalists on the ground reporting almost literally blow by blow this conflict between the police and the protesters, which was taking place right outside my window. And so the sense that we depend on these other channels to give information to us about vital events, not only in our community, but nationally, really came to a head during the events of last year. Keeping in mind that Black Lives Matter begins as a hashtag, right? And the power of Black Lives Matter as a hashtag was it allowed us to assemble examples of police violence against Black bodies all over the US. Not just stories of Klansmen in the South, but stories of police in the Midwest, in the Northeast, on the Western coast. And that each of these stories would have been covered individually by the local media, but probably would not have become a national conversation if we couldn't see the larger patterns, if we couldn't put all those cases together along with those pictures, those videos of the Karens and other things, and make the continuing role of racism in American society as visible as it's become in the last year. That it became something that couldn't be ignored, and it became understood as systemic and structural racism rather than simply individual racism, because of that ability of people to use social media to assemble. We also saw social media and fan communities play more and more visible roles in the political campaign last fall. And this is a story, Trump versus TikTok, has to do with K-pop fans who were very experienced at using digital registration systems, because K-pop fandom is all about reality competitions in Korea to form bands, various mechanisms to vote your idols up and down the charts. So the digital sophistication of K-pop fans took aim at Trump in particular during the campaign and did a number of things to disrupt his campaign rallies. But more than that, social media had created a space of dialogue around race among K-pop fans, because Black fans in the US had called out K-pop performers in Korea who were doing racial appropriation of hairstyle, of language, of dress, and did videos and blog posts to question what their practices were and to educate people, K-pop fans around the world, about the cultural sensitivities around race. And that meant K-pop fans had worked through issues of race to a high degree when the Black Lives Matter stuff really started to reach its maximum penetration into the cultural dialogue. And so they were ready to mobilize effectively their skills in the service of disrupting police surveillance on protesters and disrupting Trump's rallies. We saw political figures. This is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a young congresswoman from New York who has an enormous youth follower. She used Twitch and went on and played games with the gaming community to build up to the election and to solicit youth participation. And some of her Twitch streams reached a level of participation that was far bigger than the big Trump rallies that had sort of been the hallmark of Trump's campaign. And if you look closely here, Ilhan is another US representative that she brought to participate in those online rallies using Twitch. But for every Twitch rally for AOC, there was also the phenomenon of QAnon, which is very much using these mechanisms of participatory culture and participatory politics to collaboratively build a conspiracy theory and to perform it in the real world, building up to the insurrection at the US Capitol in early January. So QAnon raises some serious questions, ethical questions, the media studies as a field is going to have to think about deeply. And I strongly recommend HBO's documentary series, Q Into the Storm, which really takes us deep inside the participatory mechanisms, the podcasts, the blogs, the forums that played such a central role in spreading the QAnon phenomenon. And it is, like everything else, about this connection between figures like Trump, who would use mass media to give a wink or nod to the QAnon and Proud Boy protesters as building up to the election and its aftermath. And here we see this complex figure, the QAnon shaman, who on one of the episodes of my podcast, we dissect what's going on here, the mixture of Celtic and Native American mythologies in a context of Washington itself, where we have Confederate figures in the background here and official monuments, where we have the appeal of Greco-Roman architecture, just layer upon layer of mythology that was mobilized, appropriated, and remixed at this moment of the Capitol insurrection. Globally, another event that really caught my attention the last year was the struggle in China over Archive of Our Own, the major fan site, which and that was shut down by the Chinese Communist government there, and a battle between two fandoms. One was a fan of a pop idol who was an actor who appeared in a fictional program, and the pop idol fans really have a close relationship to the creative industries in China, the fan fiction writing community. And the idol fans were upset by how the fan fiction was representing their idol and appealed to the Chinese government, saying it was undermining the cultural industries of China. And the Chinese government, no doubt for censorship reasons, political, ideological reasons, but also for commercial reasons, shut down Archive of Our Own. And it has led to a year-long conversation there that I've been very actively participating in. As we think about how people dealt with the shutting down of mass media, one of the industries heavily affected in LA and all over the world were the restaurant industry, where most people had enough capital to stay closed for about 2 months and then got into financial trouble. And how was the city going to feed itself? Well, we had an armada of food trucks in LA bringing all kinds of food, many of them kinds of cuisines that had not been in physical restaurants before, but suddenly in your own neighborhood, you would see places to eat that were not available previously. And that is also part of the story of this, as are those cardboard figures that were put up in baseball spaces to maintain fan engagement during this period. The fans could buy the right to have their self reproduced as a cardboard cutout behind the ball players. I often wish that I could do that at a movie theater so that they showed movies all year round and just simply put my cardboard cutout in my favorite seat in my local cinema. We saw concerts being virtually organized within performers in different spaces, but performing live music online during this period of time. We saw film festivals like the Bologna Film Festival, the Pordenone Film Festivals in Italy, streaming their content globally for the first time. And above is Alamo Drafthouse, which is an important cult movie chain in the US, which continued to operate by selling tickets to online screenings of new releases. Well, we also saw at a more grassroots level, things like this, the performance of silent comedies, where these two film buffs showed silent comedies every week, and there's live music performed in piano by Ben Model out of his apartment. And that was a rich part of how that particular community got through the past year. A lot of us spent our time streaming, and these are just some of the shows on streaming networks that opened up. As I said, the mainstream networks, the traditional networks, broadcast networks really lost out over this period of time to streaming networks. And as that happens, there's some interesting consequences. So a lot has been made of Netflix undermining local media industries worldwide, but it has also done co-productions and redistribution of series that would not have been available in other countries. Its content is not exclusively American. And so Lupin became one of the first major international successes of foreign language television in the American marketplace. And we're seeing more of that as the year has gone on. More examples of Korean dramas, for example, doing well in the American market. This is a phenomenon at the grassroots level has been taking place over years, but now it is visible to those covering the media industries and really Lupin has been at the top of the charts for Netflix releases in the US for the last 6 months or more. But that starts to blur, we're also seeing the blurring of boundaries between cinema and streaming media. Small Axe was this incredible and important production, which was a series of 5 films, but films that are more hour long than full length, and films that ended up being distributed by streaming. It has gotten recognition both by film organizations and by television organizations, because no one can quite figure out, is it film or is it television? We know it's great media, but we don't know which it is. Oscar this year, all of the films except Minari had been released either first or simultaneously on streaming media. So that the theatrical distribution played almost no role in the life of these Best Picture nominees this year, and Oscar had to rewrite its rules just so it had films to nominate. Oops, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong buttons here. Hold on a sec. Warner's announced this decision to release all of its films this year simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max. And so some of what were anticipated to be some of the biggest films of the year are simultaneously available streaming. And that is going to have interesting consequences. Some of them have done well in theatrical distributions. Some of them, like Into the Heights, have underperformed, and people are still trying to assess whether the WB has been cannibalizing its own market. Disney's split its decision. So Raya and the Last Dragon is released, to take the 2 most recent Disney films. Raya was distributed in theaters before it was released on streaming platforms, and they charged $20 US to access Raya for the first 4 months of its release before making it free or available on Disney Plus as part of the subscription. Luca, the most recent Pixar film, was part of the subscription fee without extra charge for Disney Plus. And so we see, it turned out that they felt they gained more from getting this content upping their subscription rate as a streaming service, and there were with the other Netflix and HBO Max and the other streaming services than it was revenue as pay on demand viewing. And so again, it's going to be a while before we know what the consequences of all of this is going to be. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm going to say a word about the work we're doing on the civic imagination. I'm going to skip some slides I threw in there to deal with that a little more. But the work my team is doing on understanding how pop culture shapes our civic imagination resulted in 2 books last year. One has mentioned the pop culture and the civic imagination, which looks at case studies of 30 social movements around the world and how they've deployed pop culture as a resource, a vernacular for political speech. The other, Practicing Futures, talks about our own grassroots work. We've now done more than 100 workshop sessions in the US and beyond, bringing communities together for world building, for collaborative story making, for remixing of stories and so forth, to get people thinking, using their imagination and thinking together about shared values and norms of civic participation. And as the pandemic shut down our face-to-face workshops, we, for example, developed this toolkit for parents to use who were homeschooling their kids and create a more constructive relationship to media narratives, using a lot of ideas that we took from fandom as the basis for it. And we've been doing this global collection of stories, what we call the Atlas of the Civic Imagination, where we invited people to situate themselves in the year 2060 and look back on how the pandemic impacted the world. And we're now analyzing the more than 300 stories that have come in so far. And this is an ongoing site of participation. We've had many educators bring classes to write essays and post them through this process to encourage a reflection on what the future is. In our face-to-face workshops, we often saw sort of people say the current institutions had to melt down, had to be major disaster before we changed and got on the path of progress. And so we wanted to find out whether COVID was seen as that kind of melting down that allowed us to imagine better futures together. And there's strong evidence, in fact, that it did, and that there are shared values emerging around environmental sustainability, commitment to civil equality, critique of American global dominance, and a push toward a more multinational system of leadership. A number of things emerge there that are really important for us to factor in as we think more about it. And this is the results that leave me more optimistic than pessimistic about what the consequences politically are going to be of what we've gone through. So let me stop the share. There's a little time left for questions. I'm sorry this ran a little long, but trying to cram media for the last year into one talk has proven challenging.
Thank you so much, Henry. That's an amazing talk. It's incredibly wide-ranging and fascinating. From my own perspective, the blurring of the boundaries between various things, between public and private, and between cinema and not cinema, all of this kind of blurring of the boundaries that's happened is very interesting there. I'm curious as to what will come out of this in the future, and I don't know whether you've got any quick ideas about what the future post-COVID might actually look like. You've got quite an optimistic view, I think, there towards the end. Is there a dark side?
Oh, there's lots of dark sides. I joked earlier when we were talking that Europeans always want to ask me first about the dark side, because I think Europe loves its chocolate, its coffee, and its theory darker than Americans do. But yes, I think the dark side is important. I tried to hint at some of the dark sides there in talking, for example, about QAnon, also talking about the commercial exploitation that Netflix performs, as well as this kind of global scramble that Netflix is involved with. I think, we can always bring out the dark. I'm often accused of being too optimistic, and I said guilty as charged, but I'm trying to provide a counterbalance to other theorists who are take a darker view, at least elevate and amplify some of the things that are happening that might give us some reason for optimism. I think this blurring of the bounds between cinema and streaming worries me a lot as a cineast, right? There's signs that people are slower coming back to theaters than the medical situation would require at this point. I think that streaming is going to be part of the picture of how film operates for the long term. I don't think the Warner experiment is going to be seen as a failure in the end. And I think the fact that Disney, Warner, Paramount, other studios are invested in streaming as heavily as they are suggests they're anchoring for a push around exhibition. To me, that suggests that the local theaters that will thrive are those that are independent and build a different relationship to their consumer base, that are more community driven. So it's interesting, Alamos survived this well. In the US, some of the others have not. But if you think about Amazon and book dealers, we now live in a world where there's Amazon and independent book dealers, right? And the independents have thrived, held on, and have survived and arguably thrived in the face of Amazon in a way that Barnes and Nobles and Borders and the other chains went away. So I think we may predict something like that occurring in cinema, that keeps alive cinema going. It doesn't go away, but it may be event driven. Like there's a theater that Disney owns and Hollywood that does big events around all of its Disney releases that draw people to that theater, and it's those kinds of experiences. Or think about secret London cinema screenings, that whole phenomenon of underground screenings and theatrical events around films and so forth. And then just the local loyalty that people build to independent cinema houses, I think mean that they may be the most capable of regrouping during this period of time. And I think that's an interesting trend to pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree. It is very interesting. And certainly in conferences that we've already seen towards the end of COVID, this blurring of the boundary between cinema and other forms of kind of a streaming narrative, it was really clear as people couldn't get access actually to cinema, and we're moving towards streaming as their way of getting access. And I tend to agree that there won't be going back. And I think this idea of the community and the building, I mean, the art world having to build community, in material community in the real world, is going to be the real challenge, I think, to get people back into investing again in art. Do we have any questions, or has everybody got tired? I'm just wondering. Very quiet bunch here this evening. They were very talkative here.
There are a couple of questions cropping up there.
Sorry, I can't see.
Bottom. There's one here about TikTok. I'm trying to read as it moves up the screen, but you know, it's about. I'm not an expert on TikTok, I should say right away. Most of what I know about TikTok, I've learned from my students who've been monitoring its role in the election. But I do think it's a space that we need to spend more time looking at, given its global impact and given particularly its connection to youth culture at the current moment in time. And it and Twitch really played particularly important roles in the political culture of the pandemic time period that need to be talked about, hopefully by younger scholars, as part of the larger social media, entertainment, politics landscape that my colleague David Craig and Stuart Cunningham have written about in several books that have come out in the last year or so.
Yeah, I see there's a message actually from Eleonora Lima asking about how the online participatory culture has worked or hasn't for academia during the pandemic. Sorry, I had a moment where I wasn't seeing the messages. Now I'm seeing them again.
Yeah, so I mean, I think mixed bag. I think academic Twitter has been both a powerful tool and one that's self-destructive a lot of the time. I think it's been able to rally around some major tenure cases and put discipline-wide or academic-wide pressure on universities to revisit things with some success. I think it's allowed us to publicize events and to connect across campuses somewhat during this period of time. And I would say that's been a big success. I personally have been invited to speak in a number of global contexts that I would never have been able to do before. I did a lecture in Kazakhstan, and I was told that I was the first American academic to give a digital lecture in Kazakhstan during this. And it's an example of a place that would be very difficult for me to get to, physically during normal times, but Zoom enabled those kinds of connections. I'm a bit worried that institutions, now that they've discovered this, will put less money in our budgets to bring international speakers physically present. And I like to travel and visit people, but I am excited that we're seeing these academic tools that are tools used in academic communities to foster global conversation. And I've had a sustained engagement in China around the shutdown of our archive of our own that grew directly out of the fact that these platforms make it so easy. So I've been meeting a whole new generation of fan scholars in China through that process that I find really, really valuable.
Yeah, no, it is. It's opened up a lot. Jeremy, you've got quite a long question there. I wondered whether you might want to actually put on your video and just talk to us for a second.
Sure. I can just sort of reiterate it. I was just thinking about online, so the pedagogical implications of a lot of what we've experienced. And we're talking about participation in many forms. And I think about participation in our classrooms. And in particular, how we can strive to accommodate, especially after the ways that we've grown in a year of online instruction, thinking about the different paces at which students had opportunities to work, the kind of slowing down that we all were doing. And the ways that maybe our traditional modes of participating and assessing participation were insufficient, if not even cruel in some ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there that we've all been working through. I can talk a bit about accommodations that I've made in my teaching. One was the simple one of reducing the time on class time by about an hour, because Zoom fatigue is a very real factor in longer seminars, which tend to be what I typically teach. And so I was initially reluctant because I didn't feel like I was giving as much value to students shaving an hour off the class. But students really seemed to want it, and we did it and created other ways of interacting beyond the class time that compensated for it to some degree. It was very clear that because we had a global diaspora, that I had students waking up in the middle of the night to take classes, and that proved really challenging for lots of students. I've always used a kind of class forum function to allow everyone to write comments on the readings before class and use that to shape class discussion. But I've always been reluctant to call on students in the class who weren't raising their hands, because I didn't want to make students uncomfortable on the spot. But it's very clear for a long time, certain groups aren't able to participate in that mechanism. They need to be called on to speak. And so what I started using during this time was take the Blackboard comments, the forum comments, and use those to ask specific students about what they'd written and draw them into the conversation more. And that seemed important, that we need mechanisms where we're invited to participate. I was at the Samba schools in Rio some years back, which Stuart Papert had written about as models of participatory learning. And one of the mechanisms they had was actually a participation police that marched through the space periodically and looked for people who weren't participating and nudged them to participate. And they even had a jail they would cart you off to if you didn't participate. And then they would give you advice about how to participate more effectively. but almost anything counted as participation in that space. So being someone who couldn't dance, they'd given us all t-shirts when we walked in, and my host said, just put on the t-shirt. If you can't dance, you can be decorative. And that really stuck in my head as saying, I don't necessarily think we can participation police, but that idea of accepting multiple modes of participation, knowing students express themselves in different ways, has proven to be something I come back to often in thinking about how to foster greater participation in the classroom. So invitations to participate that don't put pressure. So calling someone to talk about something they'd already written gives them a foundation. I know there's something there to pull into the discussion. And saying that I saw that, I value it, is an important tool for fostering more participation in the classroom.
Yeah, no, great. Good answer. Thank you very much. I'm going to actually call on Massimo because I know you've got a question there. If you're still here, Massimo, to actually ask your question.
I'm here, actually. I'm, as you can see, my virtual Zoom backdrop. I'm on campus virtually. I'm still at home, as a matter of fact.
I love how we display where our head's at with our background.
Yes, I mean, that's the embarrassing thing about this kind of, green backdrop. No, I had a question about ARGs, so alternative reality games, so-called, because it came up in my class. I taught a class which, in the spring of, actually in the fall 2020. So we were remotely. We were remote, but I taught a class on paranoid fictions and conspiracy theories based on Italian, of course, including the Wuming, but also in particular Umberto Eco and the way that he formulated, right. So, but clearly, immediately, this thing came up because I had 3 or 4 students, gamers, serious gamers in class, and immediately came up and sort of hijacked the whole discussion, because clearly that's a step further in that kind of participatory culture that you describe, and sort of. And I was just wondering whether you had any specific thoughts about this phenomena and whether they up the ante, so to speak, or because of course they are also connected to QAnon and all that, the genealogy there. There are some people who think that ARGs are actually the sort of the cradle of QAnon and other with all the clear infiltrations and the manipulations they also allowed in this. So I'm bringing you back to the dark side here. So.
Sure. We can go dark if people want to do that. No, so I will, I would say I was really early on very excited about ARGs because they fostered forms of collective intelligence, to use Pierre Levy's term, massive collaboration and solving problems quickly, and the capacities they revealed of people were leaving people with a sense of civic empowerment, as Jane McGonigal's writing about ARGs early on made clear. People thought they could go out in the world and solve real world crimes together as easily as they could solve puzzles that were constructed for them to be solved, right? And the problem with real world crimes is, of course, they don't have clear paths to resolution. And there were real people involved and real tragedy and trauma involved. So from the very beginning, this issue has surrounded ARG, and particularly the blurring of boundaries. This is not a game philosophy, where you mask the fictiveness of ARGs. Commercially, the ARG is largely dead, but it remains a grassroots movement. Augmented reality games like Pokemon Go and the wizard game for Harry Potter have proven more effective because they don't require everyone to be playing at the same time. They're not a one and done phenomenon. You use up an augmented reality game quickly, and as a result, it's burnt out. And so no one commercially wants to build them in that regard. But because it moved grassroots, then we can research people have done on QAnon suggest a high number of the leaders of QAnon had come out of ARG participation. So it's not necessarily that QAnon was conceived as an ARG so much as principles of mobilizing massive number of people and building collaborative realities created that. This blurring of the lines of fact and fantasy, the game theorist and designer Mary Flanagan writes about that in her book on critical play, and the consequences of hipster, gamers intruding into the worlds of, say, housing insecure people in public places and disrupting their experience. The class consequences of that is something that she describes there. The ethic of recognizing that other people occupying the same space are living in different realities. We saw that with Pokemon Go, where people were going to Holocaust sites and where Pokemon were put in place by the designers because they were automatically layered over the landscape and behaving inappropriately for the spaces they were in, or at graveyards where he accidentally disrupted funerals because people descended on the gravesite, chasing Pokemon while people were there mourning their losses. So there are lots of ethical concerns about that blurring of boundaries that I think we need to pay attention to. And QAnon, if it is started as an ARG, illustrates the potential of confusion, of misinformation, disinformation, becoming part of the reality. And the same thing happens in digital space more generally, where these artifacts of ARG that have been abandoned are there to be found by, say, students doing research who then incorporate something from the Beast or I Love Bees into their research paper as if it was a real phenomenon, because their fictiveness is unmarked. And we've seen examples of that as well. So it's a complex question.
Yeah.
There definitely are dark sides or ethical dilemmas to be dealt with in it. I also think there's a positive side in terms of collective intelligence and collaboration and agency that comes out of that particular mode of play that still excites and intrigues me.
It's interesting. I'm sorry if I may add a quick comment. It's
Sure.
One student among those four actually ended up writing a thesis about the socially responsible ARGs. So the use of ARGs in order to, promote and foster, activist in issues, and also an awareness in general about what our ARGs are. So critical and
critical play.
Critical play. That's right, exactly like you were saying. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both, and great to have you both. I mean, Massimo will be our keynote tomorrow evening, so it's lovely to see you actually interacting together on the screen here. If I don't have any other questions, we've run over a time a little bit, so I'll close it. And I don't think we do. I think that's probably it. So thank you so much, Henry, for your talk. For your conversations with us before the talk as well, which were very much appreciated. It's been great having you involved in the summer school, and really valuable. I think there's going to be a lot to think about, and for my own research too as well. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. So thank you, and thank you all who came in this evening to listen. We're delighted. There is another keynote tomorrow evening with Massimo at the same time. You'll find it on Eventbrite. So again, talking about COVID, but from a slightly different angle. So thank you all, and have a good evening and a good morning, I suppose, for those of you coming in from the States.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.